Margaret Thompson had always believed that dogs were just pets until she met Rex. The large German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a thick coat of black and tan fur changed her mind completely. When she first saw him at the animal shelter 3 years ago, he was sitting quietly in the corner of his kennel, watching everything around him with careful attention. The shelter worker, a young woman named Sarah, explained that Rex had been brought in after his previous owner. An elderly man had passed away. The family couldn't keep him because they lived in a small apartment in the city. Rex was already 5 years old then, which made finding him a new home more difficult. Most people wanted puppies, not older dogs with unknown histories. Margaret was 68 years old and had been living alone since her husband died 2 years earlier. Her children lived in different states, busy with their own families and careers. The house felt too quiet, too empty. She had thought about getting a companion but wasn't sure she was ready for the responsibility of caring for another living being. When Sarah opened Rex's kennel, the dog didn't rush forward like many others did. Instead, he walked slowly toward Margaret and sat down in front of her. He looked directly into her eyes, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if Rex was asking her a question, waiting for her answer. She knelt down and extended her hand. Rex sniffed it gently, then placed his large head under her palm. His fur was soft despite his time at the shelter, and she could feel the warmth of his body through her fingers. At that moment, Margaret knew she had found her companion. The adoption process took a few days to complete. During that time, Margaret prepared her home for Rex's arrival. She bought a large dog bed, food and water bowls, toys, and a strong leash. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, offered advice about caring for large dogs, having owned German shepherds herself years ago. When Margaret finally brought Rex home, he explored every room slowly and carefully. He seemed to understand that this was his new territory, his new responsibility. German shepherds were known for being protective and loyal, and Rex quickly proved he was no exception. Within the first week, Rex had established his routine. He would wake up when Margaret did, around 6 in the morning. After she let him out into the backyard, he would sit patiently by his food bowl waiting for breakfast. He never begged or demanded attention, but he was always nearby, watching over her with quiet devotion. Margaret discovered that Rex had been well trained by his previous owner. He knew basic commands like sit, stay, and come. He walked perfectly on a leash without pulling or getting distracted by other dogs or squirrels. Most importantly, he seemed to understand Margaret's moods and needs without being told. On days when Margaret felt sad or lonely, Rex would come and rest his head on her lap. He wouldn't move until she felt better. When she was busy cooking or cleaning, he would lie nearby, always keeping her in sight but never getting in her way. At night, he slept on his bed beside hers, but she often woke to find him sitting up, alert and watching over her. The bond between Margaret and Rex grew stronger each day. She began taking longer walks with him, exploring parts of the neighborhood she hadn't visited in years. Rex's presence gave her confidence and purpose. Other dog owners would stop to chat, and Margaret found herself making new friends through Rex. Margaret's daughter, Susan, visited from California 3 months after Margaret adopted Rex. Susan had been worried about her mother living alone and was initially concerned about her taking on the responsibility of a large dog. However, when she saw how happy and energetic her mother had become and how devoted Rex was to her, Susan's concerns disappeared. Rex seemed to sense that Susan was important to Margaret. He was polite and gentle with her, allowing her to pet him and even bringing her his favorite toy as a gesture of acceptance. Susan was impressed by the dog's intelligence and good manners. Margaret's son, David, visited from Texas a few months later. Unlike Susan, David was not a dog person and remained somewhat wary of Rex's size and alert nature. However, Rex won him over during a thunderstorm that frightened Margaret. The dog immediately went to her side, providing comfort and courage until the storm passed. David realized that Rex wasn't just a pet, but a true guardian and companion for his mother. As time passed, Margaret and Rex developed their own special language of looks, gestures, and quiet communications. Margaret would sometimes joke to her neighbors that Rex understood her better than most people did. He seemed to anticipate her needs, bringing her slippers when her feet were cold or alerting her when someone was at the door before the doorbell rang. Rex also proved to be an excellent judge of character. He was friendly with Margaret's regular visitors like Mrs. Chen and the postal worker, but he remained watchful around strangers. Once, when a man came to the door claiming to be selling home security systems, Rex positioned himself between the man and Margaret, making it clear that the stranger was not welcome. The man left quickly, and Margaret later learned from neighbors that he had been attempting to scam elderly residents. The 3 years Margaret and Rex spent together were among the happiest of her later life. She often told friends that adopting Rex had given her a new lease on life. She felt safer, less lonely, and more connected to the world around her. Rex had transformed from a shelter dog with an uncertain future into a beloved family member with a clear purpose. Margaret made sure Rex received the best care possible. Regular visits to the veterinarian confirmed that he was healthy and strong. She fed him high-quality food, kept up with his grooming, and ensured he had plenty of exercise and mental stimulation. In return, Rex gave her unwavering loyalty, protection, and love. Their daily routines became precious rituals. Morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoons spent in the garden with Rex lying in the shade while Margaret tended her flowers, and evenings on the porch watching the sunset together. These simple moments created a deep bond that went beyond the typical relationship between a person and their pet. Margaret often reflected on how Rex had come into her life at exactly the right moment. She had been drowning in loneliness and grief, and he had pulled her back to the surface. Now she couldn't imagine her life without him. Rex had become not just her companion, but her closest friend, her protector, and in many ways, her reason to keep going. Neither Margaret nor Rex knew that their time together was about to be tested in ways they never could have imagined. The bond they had built over 3 years would soon be challenged by circumstances that would reveal the true depth of Rex's devotion and the power of the love between a woman and her faithful German shepherd. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Margaret had always been an early riser, but that day she didn't wake up at her usual 6 o'clock. Rex waited patiently by her bedside as he always did, but when 7 o'clock passed and then 8, he became concerned. Rex nudged Margaret's hand gently with his nose, trying to wake her. She stirred and opened her eyes, but something was different. Her movements were slower than usual, and she seemed confused about where she was for a moment. When she tried to sit up, she felt dizzy and had to lie back down. Margaret tried to reassure Rex that she was fine, just tired, but the intelligent dog wasn't convinced. He stayed closer to her than usual that day, following her from room to room and watching her carefully. When she stumbled slightly while walking to the kitchen, Rex immediately moved to her side, offering his sturdy body for support. Over the next few weeks, these episodes became more frequent. Margaret would have moments of confusion, times when she felt unusually tired and occasionally experienced shortness of breath. She tried to hide these symptoms from Rex, not wanting to worry him, but dogs have an incredible ability to sense when something is wrong with their humans. Rex's behavior began to change accordingly. He became more protective, more attentive. He would position himself near Margaret when she was cooking, ready to steady her if she became unsteady. During their walks, he would stop more frequently, seeming to sense when Margaret needed to rest even before she realized it herself. Margaret finally decided to see her doctor when she had a particularly frightening episode. She had been watering her garden when suddenly everything went black for a few seconds. When her vision cleared, she found herself on the ground with Rex standing over her, his eyes full of worry and concern. He had somehow helped break her fall, and she realized she might have been seriously injured if he hadn't been there. Dr. Williams had been Margaret's physician for over 20 years. He was a kind man in his 50s who had seen her through her husband's illness and death, and he knew how important Rex had become in her life. After running several tests, Dr. Williams sat Margaret down in his office to discuss the results. The news was not what Margaret had hoped to hear. The tests revealed that she had a serious heart condition that had been developing gradually over time. Her heart was weakening, and the episodes she had been experiencing were warning signs that her condition was getting worse. Dr. Williams explained that with proper medication and care, she might have months or even a year or more, but the disease was progressive and would eventually prove fatal. Margaret listened to the doctor's words with a strange sense of calm. At 71 years old, she had lived a full life. She had raised 2 wonderful children, had a loving marriage that lasted over 40 years, and had been blessed with 3 beautiful years with Rex. She wasn't afraid of death itself, but she was deeply worried about what would happen to Rex. During the drive home from the doctor's office, Margaret glanced at Rex sitting in the passenger seat. He seemed to sense that something significant had happened during their visit to the doctor. His usual alertness was heightened, and he kept looking at Margaret with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. That evening, Margaret called both of her children to tell them about her diagnosis. The conversations were difficult and emotional. Susan immediately offered to fly out from California to take care of her mother, but Margaret gently declined. She wanted to spend her remaining time in her own home, in familiar surroundings, with Rex by her side. David also offered to come and stay, but Margaret convinced both of her children that she wanted to live her remaining days as normally as possible. They agreed to visit more frequently and to help her make arrangements for the future, but they respected her wish to maintain her independence for as long as she could. The most difficult conversation Margaret had to have was with herself, about Rex's future. German Shepherds can live 12 to 14 years, and Rex was only 8. He could have many good years ahead of him, but he would need a new family. The thought of leaving him behind was more painful than thinking about her own death. Margaret began to make careful plans. She spoke with the veterinarian about Rex's health and temperament, gathering information that would help potential new owners understand his needs and personality. She also began to document his routines, his favorite foods, his preferred walking routes, and all the little details that made Rex unique. As Margaret's condition slowly progressed over the following months, Rex adapted to each change in her capabilities. When she could no longer take their usual long walks, he seemed content with shorter trips around the block. When she needed to rest more frequently during the day, he would lie beside her chair or bed, serving as both companion and guardian. Rex's devotion during this difficult time was extraordinary. He seemed to understand that Margaret was fragile and needed extra care. He would bring her his toys when she seemed sad, as if trying to cheer her up. He would alert her to visitors or phone calls, but he would also encourage her to rest when she looked tired. Margaret's neighbors, particularly Mrs. Chen, began stopping by more frequently to check on her and Rex. Mrs. Chen had experience with illness and loss, having cared for her own aging husband until his death several years earlier. She understood the special bond between Margaret and Rex and often commented on how remarkable the dog's intuitive care for Margaret had become. One afternoon, while Margaret was napping in her favorite chair, Mrs. Chen observed Rex's behavior through the window. The dog was sitting perfectly still beside Margaret's chair, his eyes moving constantly between Margaret's face and the room around them. He was clearly standing guard, ready to respond to any change in Margaret's condition or any potential threat to her safety. Margaret's children visited more frequently during this period, and they too were amazed by Rex's devotion. Susan remarked that Rex seemed to have appointed himself as Margaret's personal nurse and bodyguard. David, who had initially been skeptical about the dog, found himself deeply moved by Rex's unwavering loyalty and gentle care. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate gradually. She had good days and bad days, but Rex was a constant source of comfort and companionship through all of them. On her bad days, when breathing was difficult and energy was low, Rex would lie quietly beside her, his presence a source of strength and peace. On her better days, when she felt more like herself, Margaret would spend time talking to Rex about everything and nothing. She would tell him stories about her childhood, her marriage, her children's accomplishments. Rex would listen attentively, his head tilted slightly to one side as if he understood every word. Margaret also began to prepare Rex for what was to come, though she wasn't sure how much he could understand. She would hold his head in her hands and tell him how much she loved him, how grateful she was for the joy he had brought to her life, and how she hoped he would be happy with a new family when the time came. Rex would look into her eyes during these conversations with an expression that seemed almost human in its depth and understanding. Margaret sometimes wondered if Rex knew what was happening better than anyone realized. His behavior suggested that he was preparing himself for something, though exactly what remained to be seen. Winter brought with it a noticeable decline in Margaret's health. The cold weather made breathing more difficult, and she found herself spending most of her time indoors. Rex adapted to this new reality with remarkable patience and understanding. He seemed to know that their outdoor adventures were coming to an end, and he made the most of every moment they could still share together. Margaret's daughter Susan arrived from California in early December to spend what they all suspected might be Margaret's last Christmas. When Susan walked through the front door, she was struck by how much her mother had changed since her last visit in the fall. Margaret was frailer, moved more slowly, and tired easily. But what hadn't changed was the remarkable bond between her mother and Rex. Rex greeted Susan politely but remained focused on Margaret. He had positioned his bed closer to her favorite chair and rarely left her side for more than a few minutes at a time. When Margaret needed to walk to another room, Rex would rise before she did, as if anticipating her movement. He would walk slowly beside her, ready to provide support if she needed it. Susan was amazed by Rex's intuitive understanding of Margaret's condition. He seemed to know exactly when Margaret needed encouragement to eat, when she needed to rest, and when she simply needed the comfort of his presence. During Margaret's afternoon naps, Rex would lie perfectly still beside her chair, his breathing synchronized with hers. Christmas was a quiet affair. David flew in from Texas, and the small family gathered around Margaret's living room rather than the dining room, making it easier for her to participate without overexertion. Rex received several new toys and treats, but he seemed more interested in staying close to Margaret than playing with his gifts. Margaret had prepared special presents for Rex, including a new collar with his name engraved on a brass plate and a collection of his favorite treats. But the most important gift she gave him was less tangible: hours of gentle conversation and affection, storing up memories and love for both of them. After the holidays, Margaret's condition worsened more rapidly. Dr. Williams began making house calls, understanding that traveling to his office had become too difficult for Margaret. During one of these visits, he privately told Susan and David that their mother likely had only weeks, possibly days, left. Rex seemed to sense the change in the household's atmosphere. The family discussions that stopped when Margaret entered the room, the increased number of visitors, the tension in Susan's and David's voices when they thought Margaret couldn't hear. All of these changes registered with Rex's sharp instincts. The dog's behavior became even more protective and attentive. He would position himself between Margaret and anyone who approached her, not aggressively but clearly establishing himself as her guardian. He refused to leave her side even when Susan or David offered to take him for walks. It was as if Rex understood that his time with Margaret was precious and limited. One evening in late January, Margaret had what everyone recognized as a very bad night. Her breathing was labored, and she seemed to drift in and out of consciousness. Susan and David took turns sitting with her while Rex maintained his constant vigil from his position beside her bed. Around 3 a.m, Margaret woke up and reached out her hand to Rex. He immediately moved closer, placing his head gently on the bed where she could touch him easily. Margaret looked into Rex's eyes and spoke to him in a whisper that only he could hear. She told Rex that she loved him more than words could express. She thanked him for 3 years of unconditional love, loyalty, and companionship. She told him that he had saved her from loneliness and given her life meaning when she had lost hope. Most importantly, she told him that he would need to be brave when she was gone, and that she trusted him to be a good companion to whoever would love him next. Rex seemed to listen to every word, his intelligent eyes never leaving Margaret's face. When she finished speaking, he gently licked her hand and then rested his head on the bed beside her arm, as close as he could get without disturbing her. The next morning brought a brief improvement in Margaret's condition. She was more alert and seemed to have found some reserve of energy. She asked Susan to help her sit in her favorite chair in the living room, where she could look out at the garden she had tended for so many years. Rex immediately took his position beside the chair, but Margaret asked Susan to bring his bed closer so he could lie down while still being near her. As Rex settled onto his bed, Margaret reached down to stroke his head, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their 3 years together. Margaret spent that day saying goodbye to the life she had known. She looked through photo albums with Susan and David, sharing memories and stories about their father, their childhood, and the many happy times the family had shared. Rex remained quietly present throughout these conversations, somehow understanding the importance and solemnity of the day. That evening, Margaret asked to be helped to her bedroom earlier than usual. She was exhausted from the emotional day and felt that she needed to rest. Rex immediately rose to follow her, and Margaret was grateful for his faithful presence. As Susan helped her mother get ready for bed, Margaret made a request that surprised everyone. She asked if Rex could sleep on the bed with her that night, something she had never allowed before. Susan and David exchanged glances but quickly agreed, understanding that this might be their mother's last night and that Rex's presence would bring her comfort. Rex seemed to understand the significance of this invitation. He jumped onto the bed carefully, settling himself gently beside Margaret without disturbing her. He laid his head near her shoulder, close enough that she could feel his warm breath and hear his steady heartbeat. Margaret fell asleep that night with one hand resting on Rex's back, drawing strength and comfort from his unwavering presence. Throughout the night, Rex remained perfectly still, as if he knew that his job was to guard Margaret's sleep and provide whatever comfort he could. During what would prove to be their final hours, together, Susan and David took turns checking on their mother throughout the night, and each time they looked in, they found the same peaceful scene. Margaret sleeping quietly with Rex lying protectively beside her, both of them surrounded by a sense of calm and love that spoke to the depth of their extraordinary bond. Neither Susan nor David slept much that night, sensing that something significant was happening. They spent the early morning hours talking quietly about their mother's remarkable relationship with Rex and wondering how the loyal dog would cope with the loss that seemed inevitable. None of them could have predicted exactly how Rex would choose to say goodbye to the woman who had saved him from the animal shelter and given him 3 years of love and purpose. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at dawn on a cold February morning. Rex was the first to know. Susan and David, who had been taking turns checking on their mother throughout the night, found Rex sitting perfectly still beside the bed, his head lowered and his eyes fixed on Margaret's peaceful face. The dog had not moved from his position beside her, but something in his posture told them immediately what had happened. Rex looked up at Susan and David when they entered the room, and in his eyes they saw a depth of grief that they had never witnessed in an animal before. He seemed to understand completely what had occurred, and his quiet dignity in that moment brought tears to both of their eyes. Susan gently touched her mother's hand and confirmed what they already knew. Margaret Thompson had died quietly in her sleep, just as she would have wanted. Rex remained motionless beside the bed, as if he was standing guard over Margaret one final time. When David reached out to gently touch Rex's head, the dog accepted the comfort but did not move from his position. The next few hours were filled with the difficult but necessary tasks that follow a death. Susan called Dr. Williams, who had been expecting this call, and arrived within the hour to confirm the death and sign the necessary paperwork. David contacted the funeral home that Margaret had chosen months earlier, and they arranged for Margaret's body to be taken later that afternoon. Throughout all of these arrangements, Rex maintained his vigil beside Margaret's bed. He refused food and water, and when Susan tried to coax him outside for a bathroom break, he reluctantly went but returned immediately to his post. It was clear that Rex understood the significance of what had happened and was not ready to leave Margaret's side. When the funeral home staff arrived to take Margaret's body, they were surprised to find Rex positioned so protectively beside the bed. The funeral director, a compassionate man named Mr. Peterson who had handled many difficult situations, approached Rex slowly and spoke to him gently. Rex allowed the men to do their job but watched every movement with intense attention. As they prepared to move Margaret's body, Rex finally rose from his position. But instead of stepping away, he moved even closer to Margaret, placing his head gently on the bed beside her one final time. The gesture was so tender and heartbreaking that everyone in the room fell silent, witnessing this final goodbye between a woman and her devoted companion. Susan and David were deeply moved by Rex's behavior. They had always known that their mother and Rex shared a special bond, but seeing the dog's obvious grief and understanding made them realize just how profound that relationship had been. Rex wasn't just losing his owner. He was losing his closest friend, his purpose, and his reason for being. After Margaret's body was taken to the funeral home, Rex searched the entire house as if looking for her. He went to every room where they had spent time together, her favorite chair in the living room, the kitchen where she had prepared his meals, the garden door where they had gone out for walks. In each location, Rex would pause and wait, as if expecting Margaret to appear. Susan and David tried to comfort Rex, but he seemed inconsolable. He refused to eat, barely drank water, and spent most of his time lying in Margaret's bedroom, staring at the spot where her bed had been. The depth of his grief was evident to anyone who saw him, and both Susan and David worried about his physical and emotional well-being. The next few days were devoted to planning Margaret's funeral. She had left detailed instructions about her wishes, preferring a simple service followed by burial in the cemetery where her husband was interred. Margaret had also left specific instructions about Rex's future care, having arranged for a young couple named Tom and Lisa Martinez to adopt him. The Martinez family had been carefully chosen by Margaret months earlier. They had experience with German shepherds, lived on a large property where Rex would have room to run and play, and had no small children who might be intimidated by his size. Margaret had met them several times and was confident that they would provide Rex with a loving home. However, the question of what to do with Rex during the funeral presented an unexpected challenge. Susan and David initially planned to leave Rex at home with a neighbor while they attended the service, but Rex's condition continued to deteriorate. He had barely eaten in 3 days and seemed to be sinking deeper into depression with each passing hour. Mrs. Chen, who had been helping to care for Rex since Margaret's death, made an unusual suggestion. She had heard of cases where beloved pets were allowed to attend their owner's funeral services, and she wondered if Rex's presence might actually be beneficial for everyone involved. She pointed out that Rex had been Margaret's constant companion for 3 years and deserved the chance to say a proper goodbye. Susan and David discussed this idea with the funeral director, Mr. Peterson. He was initially hesitant, having never dealt with such a request before, but when he saw Rex's condition and heard about the extraordinary bond between Margaret and her dog, he agreed to make an exception. Rex would be allowed to attend the funeral service, provided he remained calm and didn't disrupt the proceedings. The decision to include Rex in Margaret's funeral was communicated to the other attendees, and everyone who had known Margaret understood and supported the choice. Margaret's friends and neighbors had all witnessed the remarkable relationship between the woman and her German shepherd, and many of them had commented over the years that they had never seen such devotion between a pet and owner. On the morning of the funeral, Susan and David carefully groomed Rex and attached his best collar, the one Margaret had given him for Christmas with his name engraved on the brass plate. Rex allowed them to care for him but remained listless and uninterested in anything around him. His grief was so evident that it brought tears to the eyes of everyone who saw him. The funeral service was held at the same church where Margaret and her husband had been married over 40 years earlier. Rex rode in the car with Susan and David, sitting quietly in the back seat and staring out the window, as if he was looking for Margaret somewhere in the familiar neighborhoods they passed. When they arrived at the church, Rex walked slowly beside Susan and David, his head lowered and his usual alert posture replaced by an obvious air of sadness and loss. The other funeral attendees watched with quiet respect as the grieving dog made his way into the church, where his beloved Margaret lay in her coffin, waiting for her final goodbye. The sight of Rex's obvious mourning touched everyone present and served as a powerful reminder of the love and loyalty that had defined his relationship with Margaret. As they prepared to enter the church for the service, no one could have predicted how Rex would react to seeing Margaret's coffin, or what his behavior would reveal about the true depth of his devotion to the woman who had saved him from the shelter and given him 3 years of unconditional love. The moment Rex entered the church and saw Margaret's coffin at the front of the sanctuary, his entire demeanor changed. The listless, depressed dog who had barely moved for 3 days suddenly became alert and focused. He pulled gently but firmly on his leash, clearly wanting to get closer to the wooden casket that held his beloved Margaret. Susan and David exchanged worried glances. They had hoped that bringing Rex to the funeral would help him find closure, but they hadn't anticipated such a strong reaction. Rex's behavior was not aggressive or disruptive, but his determination to reach Margaret's coffin was unmistakable. His eyes were fixed on the casket, and he began making soft whining sounds that conveyed both recognition and distress. The funeral attendees watched in fascination as Rex was led down the center aisle toward the front of the church. Many of them had known Margaret and Rex personally, having encountered them during their daily walks through the neighborhood, or having been guests in Margaret's home where Rex had always been a gracious and well-behaved host. When they reached the front rows of the church, Susan tried to guide Rex to sit beside her in the pew, but he refused to be diverted from his goal. He continued to pull gently toward the coffin, and it became clear that he would not be settled until he was allowed to get closer to Margaret. Mr. Peterson, the funeral director, nodded his permission, understanding that this was an extraordinary situation that called for flexibility and compassion. Susan and David allowed Rex to approach the coffin, expecting that once he saw and smelled that Margaret was inside, he would understand and perhaps find some peace. However, what happened next surprised everyone in the church and would become the defining moment of Margaret's funeral service. Rex walked directly to the coffin and immediately lay down beside it, pressing his body against the wooden casket as close as he could get. He positioned himself lengthwise along the coffin, his head near where Margaret's head would be inside, and his body stretched along the side. Once he had settled into this position, Rex became perfectly still and quiet, as if he had found exactly where he belonged. The sight of the large German shepherd lying protectively beside Margaret's coffin created a moment of profound silence in the church. Many of the attendees began to cry, moved by the obvious devotion and love that Rex was displaying. It was clear that in his mind, Rex was resuming his role as Margaret's guardian and companion, refusing to let her face this final journey alone. The pastor, Reverend Matthews, who had known Margaret for many years, was deeply touched by Rex's behavior. He had seen many expressions of grief and love during his years of conducting funeral services, but he had never witnessed anything quite like the loyalty Rex was demonstrating. After a moment of consideration, Reverend Matthews decided to adjust his service to acknowledge the remarkable bond between Margaret and her faithful companion. As the service began, Rex remained in his position beside the coffin. He was perfectly behaved, making no noise and causing no disruption, but he clearly had no intention of moving away from Margaret's side. His breathing was calm and steady, and he occasionally would lift his head slightly as if listening to the words being spoken about his beloved Margaret. Reverend Matthews spoke about Margaret's life, her devotion to her family, her kindness to her neighbors, and her love for Rex. He mentioned how Margaret had often said that Rex had given her a new purpose in life after her husband's death, and how the bond between them had been an inspiration to everyone who knew them. As he spoke these words, Rex's ears perked up as if he recognized that he was being discussed. Susan stood to deliver a eulogy about her mother, sharing memories of Margaret's strength, generosity, and capacity for love. She spoke about how Margaret had transformed after adopting Rex, becoming more active and engaged with life. Susan's voice broke as she described coming home to visit and finding her mother and Rex sitting together on the porch, both of them content and peaceful in each other's company. David also shared memories of his mother, focusing on her wisdom and the way she had taught him and Susan to value loyalty and commitment. He mentioned how Rex had demonstrated these same qualities in his devotion to Margaret, and how watching their relationship had taught the family new lessons about love and faithfulness. Throughout both eulogies, Rex remained motionless beside the coffin, as if he was listening to every word. When the time came for the closing prayers, Reverend Matthews invited anyone who wished to come forward and say a personal goodbye to Margaret. One by one, friends and neighbors approached the coffin to pay their final respects. Each person also acknowledged Rex, some reaching down to gently touch his head or whisper a few words to him. Rex accepted these gestures with quiet dignity, but never moved from his chosen position. Mrs. Chen was among the last to approach the coffin. She had been Margaret's closest neighbor and had witnessed the daily interactions between Margaret and Rex. As she stood beside the coffin, she spoke quietly to both Margaret and Rex, thanking Margaret for being such a wonderful friend and thanking Rex for taking such good care of her. Rex looked up at Mrs. Chen with recognition and what seemed like gratitude. As the service concluded and it came time to move Margaret's coffin to the hearse for the trip to the cemetery, everyone wondered what would happen with Rex. The pallbearers approached carefully, not wanting to disturb the grieving dog, but needing to fulfill their duty to carry Margaret to her final resting place. Susan knelt down beside Rex and spoke to him gently, explaining that they needed to move Margaret now and that he would need to step aside. Rex lifted his head and looked at Susan with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. But instead of moving away from the coffin, Rex pressed himself even closer to it, making it clear that he had no intention of leaving Margaret's side. David tried a different approach, offering Rex treats and speaking to him in encouraging tones, trying to coax him away from the coffin. Rex politely ignored the treats and remained firmly in place. His message was clear. He was not going to abandon Margaret, no matter what anyone said or did. The pallbearers waited patiently, unsure how to proceed. Mr. Peterson consulted with Susan and David, and they all realized they were facing an unprecedented situation. Rex was not being disobedient or difficult. He was simply refusing to leave the side of the woman he loved more than his own life. Several people offered suggestions. Someone thought they might be able to lift Rex and move him bodily. But Susan and David rejected this idea, feeling it would be traumatic for Rex and disrespectful to his obvious grief. Another person suggested using Rex's leash to pull him away, but again, this seemed cruel and inappropriate given the circumstances. As the standoff continued, it became increasingly clear that Rex was not going to voluntarily leave Margaret's coffin. His determination was absolute, and his devotion was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The funeral attendees watched in amazement as this remarkable dog demonstrated a level of loyalty and love that exceeded anything they had ever witnessed. Rex had made his choice, and as the minutes passed and Rex showed no signs of moving from his position beside Margaret's coffin, the atmosphere in the church shifted from surprise to deep admiration. Everyone present began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a display of loyalty and devotion that transcended the ordinary relationship between humans and their pets. Reverend Matthews approached Susan and David with a gentle suggestion that surprised everyone. He had been thinking about the situation and realized that perhaps they were approaching it from the wrong perspective. Instead of trying to separate Rex from Margaret, perhaps they should honor his devotion by allowing him to accompany her to the cemetery. The idea seemed impossible at first. No one had ever heard of a dog attending a burial service. But as they discussed it further, everyone began to see the wisdom and beauty in Reverend Matthews's suggestion. Margaret had loved Rex deeply, and she would have wanted him to be wherever he felt he needed to be during this difficult time. Mr. Peterson was initially concerned about the logistics and potential complications, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this situation called for extraordinary measures. He had handled hundreds of funerals during his career, but he had never encountered a case where the deceased's companion showed such obvious need to remain close during the final farewell. Susan and David consulted quietly with each other. While the church full of people waited respectfully, they both felt conflicted. Part of them wanted to honor Rex's devotion, but another part worried about the practical difficulties and potential problems that might arise. However, as they watched Rex lying so peacefully and protectively beside their mother's coffin, they realized that separating them would be more traumatic for everyone involved than finding a way to keep them together. After several minutes of discussion, Susan announced to the gathered mourners that they had decided to honor Rex's wishes and allow him to accompany Margaret to the cemetery. The decision was met with approving nods and quiet murmurs of support from everyone present. Many people commented that it was exactly what Margaret would have wanted, and that Rex's devotion deserved to be respected and celebrated. The logistics of transporting Rex with the coffin required some creative problem-solving. The hearse was not designed to accommodate a large dog, but Mr. Peterson's assistant suggested that Rex could travel in one of the family cars that would be following immediately behind the hearse. This way, Rex could remain close to Margaret while still being transported safely and appropriately. However, when they attempted to implement this plan, Rex created another challenge. He was willing to walk beside the coffin as it was moved from the church to the hearse, but when they tried to place him in a separate car, he became agitated and began to whine softly. It was clear that Rex understood that Margaret was in the hearse, and he wanted to be as close to her as possible during the journey to the cemetery. Mr. Peterson made an executive decision that demonstrated remarkable compassion and understanding. He arranged for the back of the hearse to be modified so that Rex could travel in the same vehicle as Margaret's coffin. There was enough space for Rex to lie down near the coffin without interfering with its secure placement, and the arrangement would allow him to maintain his self-appointed vigil during the drive to the cemetery. The procession to the cemetery was unlike anything the funeral home staff had ever organized. Rex traveled peacefully in the hearse, lying quietly beside Margaret's coffin, just as he had positioned himself in the church. His presence seemed to bring a sense of completeness to the journey, as if Margaret was not traveling alone to her final resting place but was accompanied by her most faithful companion. At the cemetery, Rex's behavior continued to amaze everyone present. When the hearse arrived at Margaret's gravesite, Rex waited patiently as the pallbearers carefully removed the coffin. He then immediately positioned himself beside it again, resuming his protective stance as the coffin was placed on the lowering device over the open grave. The cemetery workers had been briefed about Rex's presence and were prepared to work around him as needed. They had never had to accommodate a grieving pet before, but they were moved by Rex's obvious devotion and wanted to be as respectful as possible of his need to remain close to Margaret. As Reverend Matthews conducted the graveside service, Rex lay quietly beside the coffin, his head resting on his paws and his eyes fixed on the wooden casket that contained his beloved Margaret. The sight of the faithful German shepherd maintaining his vigil at the graveside added a profound dimension to the burial service that touched everyone present. The graveside service included readings from Scripture about eternal love and the bonds that transcend death. As these words were spoken, many people looked at Rex and felt that they were witnessing a living example of the very devotion and faithfulness being described. Rex's presence served as a powerful reminder that love comes in many forms, and that true loyalty knows no boundaries. When it came time for the final prayers and the lowering of the coffin into the grave, everyone wondered how Rex would react to this ultimate separation from Margaret. The cemetery workers approached their task with unusual care and sensitivity, aware that they were not just burying Margaret Thompson, but also helping a grieving companion say his final goodbye. As the coffin began its slow descent into the earth, Rex lifted his head and watched with obvious understanding of what was happening. He did not become agitated or try to follow the coffin into the grave. Instead, he remained in his position, his eyes never leaving the coffin until it came to rest at the bottom of the grave. The moment when the coffin disappeared from view was emotionally overwhelming for everyone present, but perhaps most of all for Rex. He continued to lie beside the grave, staring down into the earth where Margaret now rested. His quiet dignity in the face of this ultimate separation was both heartbreaking and inspiring. As the cemetery workers began the process of filling the grave, Rex finally rose from his position. But instead of walking away, he moved to stand directly at the head of the grave as if taking up a new post as guardian of Margaret's final resting place. His transformation from grieving companion to steadfast sentinel was evident to everyone watching. Susan and David approached Rex gently, knowing that they would soon need to take him home and begin the difficult process of helping him adjust to life without Margaret. They had promised their mother that they would ensure Rex found a loving new home with the Martinez family. But first they wanted to give him as much time as he needed to say his final goodbye to the woman who had meant everything to him. Rex accepted their presence and even allowed them to pet him gently, but he showed no inclination to leave the gravesite. As the afternoon sun began to set and the other mourners started to depart, Rex remained at his post beside Margaret's grave, faithful to the end and unwilling to abandon his beloved companion even in death. The cemetery staff had never encountered a situation quite like this one, and they were unsure how to proceed. Rex was not causing any problems or disrupting any other services, but they had never had a pet take up residence at a gravesite before. It was clear that Rex had no intention of leaving voluntarily, and everyone involved began to realize that they were dealing with a level of devotion that defied conventional solutions. As evening approached and the cemetery began to empty, Rex remained steadfast at Margaret's grave. Susan and David sat on a nearby bench, watching their mother's devoted companion and struggling with what to do next. They couldn't simply leave Rex at the cemetery overnight, but they also couldn't bear the thought of forcing him away from Margaret when he so clearly felt he belonged there. Mrs. Chen, who had stayed longer than most of the other mourners, approached Susan and David with a practical suggestion. She offered to bring Rex some food and water, as he had not eaten properly in days and would need sustenance if he was going to maintain his vigil. Her kindness reflected the community's growing understanding that Rex's devotion deserved to be supported rather than discouraged. The cemetery groundskeeper, an older man named Frank, who had worked at the cemetery for over 30 years, had been watching the situation with great interest. He had seen many displays of grief over the decades, but nothing had ever touched him quite like Rex's unwavering loyalty. Frank approached Susan and David with an unprecedented offer. He would allow Rex to remain at the gravesite for as long as the dog felt he needed to be there. Frank explained that he had never made such an exception before, but Rex's behavior had shown him something remarkable about the power of love and devotion. He promised to check on Rex regularly, ensure he had access to food and water, and provide whatever care the grieving dog might need. The cemetery had never had a resident pet before, but Frank felt that Rex had earned the right to stay close to Margaret for as long as he wished. This generous offer created a dilemma for Susan and David. They wanted to respect Rex's obvious need to remain with Margaret, but they were also concerned about the practical and legal implications of leaving him at the cemetery. They worried about Rex's health, his safety, and the possibility that his presence might become a problem for the cemetery management or other visitors. After much discussion and several phone calls, a unique arrangement was reached. Rex would be allowed to spend his days at Margaret's gravesite, but Susan and David would take him home each evening to ensure he had proper shelter, food, and care. This compromise honored Rex's devotion, while also addressing the practical concerns about his well-being. The first night was difficult for everyone involved. When David attempted to lead Rex away from the grave at sunset, the dog resisted strongly. He clearly did not want to leave Margaret alone in the dark, cold ground. It took considerable patience and gentle coaxing to convince Rex to come with them, and even then, he looked back at the grave repeatedly as they walked to the car. At Susan and David's hotel that night, Rex was restless and obviously unhappy. He paced from room to room, searching for Margaret and whining softly when he couldn't find her. He refused food and only drank water when strongly encouraged. It was clear that being away from Margaret's grave was causing him significant distress. The next morning, Rex was waiting by the door before anyone else was awake, eager to return to the cemetery. The moment they arrived at Margaret's gravesite, Rex's demeanor changed completely. He settled into his position beside the grave with obvious relief and contentment, as if he had found his way home after a difficult journey. This pattern continued for several days. Each morning, Rex would return to the cemetery and take up his post at Margaret's grave. He would remain there throughout the day, accepting visits from Margaret's friends and neighbors who came to pay their respects. Many people were moved to tears by the sight of the faithful German shepherd maintaining his vigil, and several brought flowers not only for Margaret, but also treats and toys for Rex. Frank, the groundskeeper, became Rex's unofficial caretaker during the day. He would bring Rex fresh water, offer him food, and provide companionship during the long hours of waiting. Frank later said that watching Rex's devotion had restored his faith in the power of love, and had reminded him why his work at the cemetery was so important. As days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, Rex's routine became well established. He would arrive at the cemetery each morning, take his position beside Margaret's grave, and remain there until evening when Susan or David came to take him home. His presence became a source of comfort not only for Margaret's family but also for other cemetery visitors who were dealing with their own losses. Stories about Rex began to spread throughout the community and beyond. Local newspaper reporters heard about the devoted German shepherd who refused to leave his owner's grave, and they came to the cemetery to document his remarkable display of loyalty. Television news crews followed, and soon Rex's story was being shared across the country and around the world. People from distant places began making pilgrimages to visit Rex and Margaret's grave. They brought flowers, dog treats, toys, and messages of support for the faithful companion who had touched their hearts. Many visitors said that seeing Rex's devotion had helped them process their own grief and had reminded them of the importance of loyalty and love in their own lives. The Martinez family, who had been chosen by Margaret to be Rex's new owners, visited the cemetery to meet him and assess the situation. Tom and Lisa Martinez were deeply moved by Rex's behavior and expressed their willingness to wait as long as necessary for Rex to be ready to come home with them. They understood that Rex was working through his grief in his own way, and that rushing the process would not benefit anyone. After 3 weeks of daily visits to Margaret's grave, Rex's behavior began to show subtle signs of change. While he still maintained his vigil, he became more responsive to visitors and more willing to accept food and water. He would lift his head when people approached and occasionally would even allow strangers to pet him gently. Susan and David interpreted these changes as signs that Rex was beginning to process his grief and might eventually be ready to move forward with his life. They continued their patient routine of bringing him to the cemetery each day and taking him home each night, waiting for Rex to signal when he was ready for the next phase of his journey. 1 month after Margaret's funeral, on a warm spring morning when the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the cemetery, Rex's behavior changed in a way that surprised everyone. When Susan brought him to the gravesite that morning, Rex approached Margaret's grave as usual. But instead of immediately lying down in his customary position, he sat beside the headstone and looked around the cemetery as if seeing it clearly for the first time in weeks. After several minutes of quiet contemplation, Rex approached the headstone and gently placed his nose against the engraved letters of Margaret's name. He remained in this position for a long moment as if he was saying a private goodbye. Then he stepped back, looked at the grave one final time, and walked over to where Susan was standing. Rex looked up at Susan with eyes that, while still sad, seemed to hold a new sense of acceptance and readiness. For the first time since Margaret's death, Rex appeared to be indicating that he was ready to leave the cemetery and begin the next chapter of his life. Susan knelt down and took Rex's head in her hands, just as Margaret used to do. She told Rex that Margaret would always be in his heart, just as he would always be in hers. She explained that Margaret had chosen a wonderful, new family for him and that it was time for Rex to honor Margaret's memory by allowing himself to be loved and to love again. Rex listened to Susan's words, with the same attention he had once given to Margaret's conversations. When she finished speaking, Rex licked Susan's hand gently and then walked with her toward the cemetery entrance without looking back at Margaret's grave. The month-long vigil was over, but Rex's demonstration of unwavering loyalty and love had touched countless lives and had shown the world that the bonds between humans and their animal companions can transcend even death itself. Rex's devotion to Margaret had become a testament to the power of love, the meaning of faithfulness, and the extraordinary capacity for emotion and understanding that exists in our animal friends. Rex went to live with the Martinez family, where he was welcomed with patience, understanding, and love. While he never forgot Margaret and the 3 years they shared together, Rex eventually opened his heart to his new family and found happiness again. His story continued to inspire people around the world, serving as a powerful reminder that love, loyalty, and devotion are among the most precious gifts we can offer to one another, whether we walk on 2 legs or 4.